It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce the invited talk of Eva Hudlicka. Eva Hudlicka is a really well-known name between the people that are doing cognitive science. Nowadays, she is president of psychometrics in Blacksburg, United States. Before, she worked as senior scientist in DBN, USA. And I must say that I always very enjoy her presentation. So I will brief and not bother you with a longer introduction when I'm over giving her the word. Please, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Thanks for coming. I have my coffee, I have my water, so all I need is aspirin, and we're going to be all set here. So what I'd like to talk to you about is some approaches to incorporating emotion in user models and cognitive agent architectures. And emotions always seem to stir up strong feelings and often extreme views. So I'll start out with a couple of these views. So according to some people, emotions can be considered or should be considered as diseases of the mind. That was a view by Immanuel Kant. That's not Immanuel Kant. That's a gargoyle from Oxford. At the other extreme, we have a view that emotions are in fact necessary for adaptive, intelligent behavior and decision-making. And that's exemplified by this quote from David Hume, that in fact emotions should control reason and should control cognition. So, and of course there's everything in between. So let me just show you a couple of examples of what would too little emotion look like in a human, or sort of a human.
Adjust the sine wave of this magnetic envelope so that antineutrons can pass through it, the antigravitons cannot. What is the electronic configuration of gadolinium? How do you feel? How do you feel? How do you feel?
I do not understand the question.
Okay, well, that's, of course, Mr. Spock. The sound quality isn't very good on this hypercam, but he's being asked a series of completely impossible questions about Star Trek physics, and he gets the answers, and then he's being asked how he feels, and he doesn't know. So it's close. It's not exactly a human, but close enough. So, so I don't know if that was Kant's ideal of emotion, but that's certainly what it might look like with no emotion. And you can imagine what the consequences would be for interaction. So here's an example of perhaps too much emotion. Again, the sound quality on this is really awful, but the dialogue is really not all that relevant. Okay, so I guess this clip kind of maybe demonstrates why emotion has often had sort of a secondary standing in academic research, because until fairly recently it was associated with psychopathology and inappropriate displays of emotion. And I guess I guess what I'd like to argue is that in fact there is a middle ground, and we really should start thinking about how much emotion to incorporate in human-computer interactions, in affective user models. We don't necessarily always need them, but we do need them sometimes, and we just need to think some more about exactly what kind of emotions to model, and what aspects of emotions, when to model them, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. So I'll start out with some motivation and objectives. I'll spend a fair bit of time on background from psychology, experimental and cognitive psychology research, because they're really, if we're going to be modeling emotions in computational models, we really need to educate ourselves, and the theories and data from psychology are extremely helpful and necessary if we're going to be building any kind of functional models. Then I'll move on to talk about some of the guidelines for building computational models of emotions in affective user models or agent architectures. And then I'll indicate how those guidelines, in fact, define sort of a framework for analysis of these models, and then move on to summary and conclusions. So let me show you really quickly sort of a state-of-the-art. This is a video clip of some work of a robot called Kismet by Cynthia Brazel at the MIT Media Lab. And what Kismet does is he understands speech, just the prosodic qualities, not content, and he reacts to it. He reacts to the tone of speech in an appropriate affective manner. So he has, let's see. He has eyes, eyebrows, ears, mouth, and he can also move his head. And you'll see how he's going to be spoken to in actually different languages, but very distinct tones of voices, and you'll see his facial expression change.
Nice robot. You're such a cute little robot. You're so cute. Good job, Kismet. No, you're not to do that. No. That's not appropriate. No. No. Which is a bit.
Okay. So you can see how so Kismet actually has a fairly sophisticated model of emotion that's underlying this recognition and this generation. And so the question is, how can we? I might show that in the panel. This is another clip of an affective virtual agent done by John Gratch and Stacy Marcella at the ICT. But whoops. Okay, so the question is, what do we need to do to generate the kinds of Kismet-like behavior, or the behavior that I'll show you later about that virtual agent? Well, first of all, we need to sense the user's affective signals and recognize his emotional state. We need to then somehow react to it. So this is an example of a synthetic face. This is work by Fiorella de Rossis at University of Bari. So we need to express the emotion. I put the emotion in quotes because obviously computers don't actually feel the emotions, but they can generate expressions that correspond to what looks like emotions. And depending on the situation, the computer might express different kinds of emotions. So we have the input, we have the output, and what happens in the middle. And this is what I'd like to address in this talk, is what do we need computationally to actually help recognize the emotion, to help predict what the user, how the user will react, and therefore what kinds of emotion the computer or the agent should express. And that's what the affective user models are about in the cognitive-affective architectures. So just to kind of summarize, why should we include emotions in user models and agent architectures? Well, first of all, emotion is a critical component of social interaction and individual motivation. So if we're going to be building systems that interact with people, with humans, we need to take emotion into consideration. So models that actually include emotion are more realistic, and they enable more socially appropriate dialogue in terms of tone, in terms of content, turn-taking. They also enable more effective dialogue, so in terms of persuasive dialogue or empathic agents, which is, of course, relevant to a number of different kinds of systems. We can infer implied meaning and motivation better if we have emotional information. We can predict how the user will react to the system's utterances. So it just makes for more effective collaboration and interaction. In terms of affective agent architectures, again, if we have social agents, then agents which include emotions can generate more socially appropriate responses and behavior. And emotions may improve agent autonomy in complex, uncertain environments, and that's sort of an open question. So basically, having affective user models, having cognitive-affective architectures enables affect-adaptive user interfaces and affect-adaptive responses to the user, to the humans. So let me move on to the background information on emotion. So first of all, we should start out with a definition of emotion. And interestingly enough, a lot of times when you go into the research literature in psychology, you don't actually see a definition. What you see is, people will say emotions are it's fast, undifferentiated information processing, or emotions help manage goals. So you're actually seeing definitions in terms of roles or characteristics descriptions. And it's kind of telling because it really tells us that we don't really understand what emotions are. At sort of a very fundamental level, we really still don't understand what they are. We can describe them, but we don't understand them. But nevertheless, there is sort of a high-level definition, and that is that emotions are evaluative judgments of world, others, ourselves, in light of our goals and beliefs, in light of the agent's goals and beliefs. So emotions are evaluations they're inherently linked to goals, and they're evaluations of what's currently going on. Is it helping me accomplish my goals, or is it hindering me in accomplishing my goals? So that's kind of a fundamental quality. So in terms of the roles of emotions, I like to divide them into two categories. There are the interpersonal roles, the social roles, and there are the intrapsychic roles, the sort of self-regulatory roles. So the social roles, there is social coordination, there is rapid communication of behavioral intent, and that's, of course, done through the various modalities that are available for expressing emotion. So primarily facial expression, speech, both content and speech properties, gesture, posture, specific actions, specific behavioral choices. In the intrapsychic realm, we have motivation. Emotions mediate the reward and punishment mechanisms. Homeostasis, the basic drives, basic needs are mediated by emotions, and adaptive behavior. Emotions help us quickly react to dangerous situations that we don't really have time to think about it. And they do this by sort of two fundamental mechanisms. Emotion generation. First we interpret the situation and we generate the emotion, usually by cognitive appraisal. And then once the emotion is generated, it exerts a variety of effects on a number of cognitive and behavioral processes. So that's sort of the second fundamental process, and I'll talk more about that later. And these processes implement a number of the roles that emotions are usually associated with. So global interrupt system, the idea there is that you're doing something, some new stimulus arrives that needs your attention, and you quickly reorient yourself and start paying attention to it. So if you're preparing a talk and all of a sudden your dog comes in and does something horrible on the rug, then you presumably stop preparing the talk and deal with the dog. So it involves goal management, it involves reprioritization of goals, and it also involves preparation for coordinated action. So that's sort of a quick drive-by summary of emotion roles. Next thing is, how do we recognize an emotion if we see one? What is an emotion? And the key thing about emotions is that they're very complex phenomena, and they're manifested across multiple interacting modalities. And the four that are usually specified are these four. So we have the somatic physiological, that's basically your neuroendocrine systems, your heart rate, your galvanic skin response. You have the cognitive interpretive, which is the sort of nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so kind of an interpretation. And that is that things don't have an inherent emotional value, but they're only emotional to the extent that you interpret them as reflecting a certain emotion or reflecting on your goals. There's the behavioral motivational aspect. That's the sort of action-oriented, the visible, expressive aspect, the stuff that we see. And then there's the sort of the most problematic one, that as far as modeling is concerned, this sort of the experiential, the highly subjective feeling that we get, which is very difficult to measure. It's highly idiosyncratic. It's linked to consciousness, and it certainly creates problems for modeling. And in fact, this was one of the reasons that, for example, behaviorists just completely ignored emotions, because they associated with this feeling and with this aspect of emotions, and since you couldn't measure it, it didn't exist. So. And what's interesting is that a lot of the terminological confusion about emotion, if you go into the literature, and there have been various debates about what's emotion, is it a feeling, is it a thought, a lot of the terminological confusion actually comes from not recognizing this very complex multimodal nature. And so a lot of these debates, I think, can be resolved if we just say, well, emotions are all of these things, and they interact, and we don't really fully understand exactly how they interact, but we have to consider them when we think about emotions. So just to show you an example, so this might be a signature. Different emotions might have different signatures in terms of these modalities. So for example, if you're walking down a dark alley and a large approach at night, and a large approaching object you start seeing a large approaching object, your heart rate will go up, so there's your physiological response. Probably not too much of a cognitive thing. You might just think, oh, I'll be crushed or I'll be attacked. You'll have a very strong behavioral response. It may or may not be appropriate. And you'll certainly have a strong subjective response. So this is just kind of an illustration. And of course, these things will vary, because if you have a, say, complex fear like global warming or something, then obviously the cognitive component would be much higher, and probably these would be lower. So these are some things to consider when you're modeling emotions and when you're modeling users' emotions, to kind of give you a sense of the kinds of knowledge that has to be represented. And another thing I'd like to mention, emotion is used kind of loosely, and emotion kind of covers a lot of different kinds of phenomena. But in fact, in experimental psychology, it has a fairly technical meaning. So let me just spend a few words talking about that. So for lack of a better word, I'll just talk about affective factors to cover all these different factors. So we have, at the most fundamental level, we have traits, which are sort of more stable characteristics, and we have transient states. Under the traits, there are many trait sets that have been defined by various types of psychologists. The Big Five is an example that includes introversion, emotional stability. It's sort of the best known one in personality psychology. Not all traits are affective, obviously, but a lot of them are. In terms of states, we have affective states, emotions, and moods. Affective states are fairly undifferentiated, so they kind of reflect positive, negative evaluation, and they have correspondingly undifferentiated behavioral tendencies. So if you have a positive evaluation, you tend to approach; negative, you tend to avoid. I keep clicking the pointer when I want to change the slide. The emotions, we can divide them into basic and complex. Basic emotions are kind of your familiar fear, joy, anger, disgust, happiness, unhappiness, sadness. So those are the basic emotions. And then we have complex emotions, which have a much larger cognitive component. So because they have so much larger cognitive component, there's much more room for individual idiosyncrasies and interpretations and variations across individuals, across cultures. And then we have moods. One thing I should say, emotions tend to last on the order of seconds, minutes. Moods are much longer lasting on the order of hours, days, even months. And moods tend to be kind of more aligned with the basic emotions. So we also have a number of other sort of attitudes, preferences, which are factors which have a strong affective component. So again, this is something to consider when we're modeling emotions, because we're not going to have a system that models all of this, and we need to sort of make choices about what's most relevant for a particular application. So let me talk about these two core processes of emotion. So on the one hand, we have the stimuli arrive, they're interpreted by the cognitive appraisal in terms of the current goals, situations, expectations, and they generate some kind of an emotion. And that's the generation of emotion via appraisal. And then the emotions influence behavior, of course. They also feed back and influence the cognitive processes, including the appraisal processes themselves, and that would be the effects of emotions. So let me spend a little bit of time talking about those. So emotion generation via appraisal, basically it's a fairly simple mapping at some levels. Stimuli come in, appraisal process does what it does, and emotions come out. So what happens in between? Well, first of all, it has to be remembered the stimuli are going to be perceived, so you immediately see a growling bear and you react to it, but not necessarily. You can remember a growling bear, or you can anticipate that you're going to encounter a growling bear. And these are factors, again, that need to be considered in the intensity and in the representational issues. There are obviously temporal issues involved, and depending on what you choose to model. Okay. The thing about appraisal that's really important to emphasize is, as we all know, emotions are highly idiosyncratic, highly individual. And the more complex the stimuli get, the more individual and idiosyncratic the reactions become. So let's pick a non-neutral stimulus here, and let's think about what the reaction might be. And I guess some people could react this way. Other people might react this way. So when we consider, so this is what the appraisal does. It takes the goals, it takes the desires, the values, the standards, our beliefs. What do we know about the stimulus? What are the expectations that we have? And of course, that process is influenced by the existing emotions. Are we currently feeling anxious? Are we feeling calm? What mood are we in? And on our personality traits as well. And all of these factors influence what actually happens and which emotion is generated. And one idea that's come up in the last 10 or 15 years is this notion of appraisal dimensions. And appraisal dimensions are domain-independent features that are extracted from the stimuli. And the emotions are, so we don't actually go directly from the domains, but we don't go from the growling bear directly to the emotion, but we go through this intermediate level of indirection of these domain-independent appraisal dimensions, which are novelty. Is this a new thing? Valence, is this inherently good or bad? Is this relevant to any of my goals? Is this congruent with my goals? Does it help me achieve my goals, or does it hinder my goals? Who's responsible for it? Is there anything I can do about it? And then finally, how does it violate any norms that I might have, or some social norms? So these features, if you will, are extracted from the domain-dependent stimulus, and in fact, it's the vector of values that then is mapped onto the emotions. And this is a fairly common approach in most models of emotion these days, and I'll have a little bit more to say about that. So moving on to emotion effects on cognition, the key thing here is that emotion and cognition function as very closely coupled information processing systems. And once the cycle sort of gets going, it's really difficult to say which comes first and which is more important. There used to be this long debate about primacy of cognition versus emotion, and it really is not an issue if you consider both of them as functioning as information processing systems. Emotions influence fundamental processes that mediate high-level cognition. So emotions influence attention speed and capacity. They influence working memory speed and capacity, and then, of course, they influence long-term memory, recall, and encoding. And the influences are both on processing and on the contents. So we have transient biases, which influence processing, and then long-term biases result in differences in sort of permanent memory structures and permanent content. So, for example, if you have someone who's constantly anxious, they're more likely their memory is filled with schemas that relate to anxiety. If you have someone who's sort of always up, their memory schemas are going to be more concerned with good things happening. So let me just give you some specific examples. Anxiety has been studied extensively. So here are some anxiety effects. It narrows attentional focus. It reduces working memory capacity. It biases towards detection of threatening stimuli. And that's not, I'll have a little bit more to say about that, but these biases aren't always negative. That's the thing to keep in mind as we're looking at them. They might actually be highly adaptive. It also biases towards interpreting ambiguous stimuli as threatening, and it promotes self-focus. And looking at positive emotions, they increase estimates of the degree of control, how much control we have coping. They overestimate the likelihood of positive events. So, for example, it turns out that slightly depressed people actually have a more realistic view of things, and it's the happy people who have a distorted view. They've done some interesting studies with that. So there's a cheerful thought. They promote creative problem solving, and they promote sort of big picture thinking, looking at the forest. And of course, the negative emotions do the opposite in all that. So negative emotions are associated with more analytical, more focused, sort of focusing on the trees type of thinking. And again, it's very important to emphasize that biases can be adaptive or maladaptive, and it really depends on the context. And in fact, in the psychological literature, the term is often, biases often have sort of a common sense connotation is that bias is negative. But in the psychological literature, in fact, frequently this is referred to as biases and heuristics. So in fact, a lot of times the affective biases are helpful heuristics. And you can't have a talk without a Larson cartoon. So here's an example of an adaptive bias where it should have been an adaptive bias, where these people are roasting some hot dogs in the woods, and they're completely ignoring this giant monster that's about to eat them, and they're just happy that the crickets have stopped talking. So this would have been this is a demonstration where a little bit of a threat bias would have probably been a good thing. So, okay, so let me move on to the computational models of emotion. And what I'll do is I'll start out with a set of questions that we can ask ourselves as we build these models, and then the answers to the questions should then define sort of hopefully systematically the model requirements. So first of all, why and when to model emotions? We don't necessarily always need them. We really need to understand the problem domain and decide if they're needed. And unfortunately, sometimes we actually have to build a system that can handle emotions to actually be able to determine we don't need them, but that's how it goes. Which emotions do we need? And we can't model all of them, so we need to decide which ones. Which aspects of emotions? This has to do with the modalities, and I'll come back to all of these. Which of the affective processes do we need to model? Which theory do we want to implement, which of course has big implications for the kinds of knowledge and data that we need? At what level of resolution? Do we want to build sort of black box input-output models, or do we actually want to have all the details and try to emulate the kind of processing that goes on in humans? And finally, once we have all these components, how do we put them all together? What kind of an architecture do we choose? So once we have answers to all these questions, then we can start defining our knowledge and data requirements, our representational and reasoning requirements, and then choose the most appropriate representational formalism and reasoning formalism and methods. So what I'd like to do now is to basically go through these and just outline some options that are available, or some considerations that we should think about as we answer these questions. So why and when to model emotions? Well, the first reason, and this is actually my motivation, is really more research-oriented, and that is to understand how they work. How do they work in biological agents? How do cognition and emotion interact? But on the applied side, of course, if we model emotions, we can have more effective and even fun human-computer interaction. They're relevant for a variety of systems, decision support systems, training and tutoring, recommender systems, entertainment, of course. And they may produce more robust agent behavior in autonomous agents. So here are some examples. This is Kismet. Children are using Kismet to play games and for some therapeutic applications. And this is Shira de Ross's Greta, who functions as a advisor in health issues. So, okay. So which emotions and affective factors to model? This is, of course, determined by the model objectives and the application. So if you're doing affective user models for decision support systems in stressful settings, then obviously you need to model frustration, you need to model stress. So you need to model the components of stress, so fear, anxiety, frustration. You also need to model surprise and boredom. You probably don't need to worry about pride, shame, and guilt and these kinds of higher level emotions. On the other hand, if you're modeling, if you're doing synthetic agents for children, say either therapeutic settings or game playing, you certainly need to model the basic emotions, the happiness, sadness, fear, and anger. But you might also want to model some of the more complex ones. And then if you're doing models and agents in training and tutoring, you, of course, need to focus on the emotions that are relevant to learning. So these are happiness or satisfaction, fear, anxiety, frustration, surprise, boredom. So this is determined by the application. Just a quick reminder, again, that making the choice involves making a choice among these factors. And typically, you're probably not going to be modeling all of them. And there are differences, obviously, in representational and inferencing requirement associated with these. In terms of the modalities, which aspect of the emotion do we want to model? Well, again, recall the 4 modalities. Typically, you're not going to be modeling the somatic and the physiological one unless you're doing research, because we really don't understand enough about emotion to be able to model something at the physiological level and then make, have implications for the higher levels. So most often, you'll be modeling the cognitive interpretive, the cognitive appraisal, and you'll be modeling the behavioral motivational. So the agent can generate different behaviors, different facial expressions. The experiential subjective, it's people's opinions differ on this. I think it's really infeasible at the moment. It may or may not. It's not even clear what the causal status is of the sort of conscious feeling. It may be epiphenomenal. So it's just really. I guess I would just stay away from this one. Which processes do we want to model? So again, we have these 2 processes I keep mentioning. So my take on this, and not everyone would agree with that, but my take on this is that these are sort of fundamental processes which then implement the emotion roles that we hear and read about, both the social ones, the communication, the coordination, and also the intrapsychic ones, the goal management, behavior preparation, etc. So let me just talk a little bit about how we would go about modeling these 2 processes. Whoops, what's happening here? Okay, so the computational, my Mac is going nuts. Well, doesn't matter. Okay, so here are the computational tasks for appraisal models. So we, at the highest level, we have this very simple mapping. We have to map the stimuli to the emotion. Seems easy enough, but it gets more complicated, of course, because the types of stimuli vary. So we can have. Are we going to consider only external stimuli, or do we allow recollection from memory? If so, how complex will those recollections be? Do we allow real and imagined situations or stimuli, past, present, and future? Of course, has implications for temporal representation, temporal inferencing. Do we do domain-specific? Do we do the mapping directly from the domain features, or do we actually include those abstract appraisal dimensions that I was mentioning earlier? And what's the complexity of the stimulus structure? How much of the information in the environment or about the self or the other or whatever the stimulus is, how much of it do we represent? And what are the mental constructs required? Do we need to, I had mentioned earlier that emotions need goals, that emotions are evaluative judgments with respect to goals. So clearly we need to represent goals. We need to represent perhaps expectations. What else do we need to represent? So those are some of the considerations. In terms of the, not sure what's happening here. In terms of the mapping, we have to decide what is the actual mapping going to be between the stimuli. I have no idea what's going on. This has never happened with this particular Mac. We need to decide what the mapping is going to be between the stimuli and the emotions. And while there is a lot of agreement in the appraisal theories, there are some differences. How do we calculate the intensity? What are all the variables that influence intensity calculations? What's the nature of the mapping process? Are there distinct stages? How are the different functions allocated among the stages? Do these stages vary by individual, by perhaps emotional state? Do we map things differently if we're happy than if we're sad? How do we integrate multiple emotions? This is kind of the famous joke about you find out that your mother-in-law ran off a cliff and you generate one emotion and it turns out it was in your new race car, so then you generate the other emotion. So that's a non-trivial problem, because if the emotions are synergistic, then of course then you can kind of play games with intensity, but if the emotions are opposing, how do you integrate them? What do you do? Do you integrate them at the cognitive level, or do you integrate them at the behavioral level? So these are all non-trivial problems. And there's also the issue of emotion dynamics over time. Emotions aren't sort of this freeze frame kind of a single emotion happens and then nothing happens and the next emotion happens. Emotion gets generated and then it evolves. And then as it evolves along one modality, it influences the other modality. So your appraisal of, say, anxiety will influence your physiological state, which will in turn influence your behavior, which will in turn influence your further appraisal. So it's a very, very complex dynamic process. And we're just starting to understand how it works and just starting to model it. And then at the end, what's the emotion going to look like? What all do we represent in the sort of the final output, the object called emotion? Certainly we want type, we want intensity. Do we want to mention more? The cause, the direction, what's the emotion directed at? So these are all issues that we have to decide what we're going to do in our particular application. So let me just say a few words about some of the influential theories of appraisal that have influenced computational model. I'll start with the Ortonic, Clore, and Collins, the OCC model. OCC model has a fairly complex taxonomy of emotions, and what they do is they divide them into event-based emotions, which are appraised with respect to goals. So does this promote world peace? Attribution emotions, which concern acts by other agents. So they're appraised with respect to standards for behavior. Is it appropriate for John to rob the bank? And attraction emotions. So these are appraised with respect to attitudes and preferences. So do I like this? Is this appealing to me? And if we look at particular emotions, again, it's looking at this taxonomy. So we have event-based emotions are further divided into fortunes of others, so happy for, pity for, and fortunes of self. So and these are further divided into prospects, sort of future-oriented emotions, hope and fear, and well-being emotions, joy and distress. The attribution emotions are things like pride, shame, reproach. The attraction emotions are love and hate. And then we can mix them, so it gets more complicated. So we have, for example, gratitude and anger would be a mix of these different categories. And then OCC define what amounts to appraisal variables, but they define features that are used to actually calculate which emotion will be derived and what the intensity will be. So they include desirability for other. Do I like if I'm concerned about an emotion for another person, do I like them or not? If something bad happens to them and I like them, I'll feel bad. If I don't like them, maybe I'll feel good. Praiseworthiness, do I approve or disapprove of a certain behavior? Was the person really responsible for the behavior? Did they have any control, etc.? So this kind of starts giving you a sense of how you might go about implementing it. It actually kind of lays out the structures you need, the procedures that might be necessary, the representational requirements. And here's an example of how anger might be derived. So this is kind of the path through this taxonomy that might allow you to derive anger. So the OCC model was developed with the explicit purpose to develop computationally tractable models of emotion, and because of that it was adopted very early on in many of the early emotion models. So it's actually still the most widely used model, although people are starting to use other models as well. So it generates this taxonomy, fairly complex taxonomy of triggering conditions and emotion types. Not everyone agrees with this taxonomy. And it specifies variables that influence intensity, so global sort of physiological state and these local variables that were there in blue. I apologize for this. I really don't know what's going on, why it just goes berserk like that. And there, as I said, there are many implementations by a number of people, and if you're interested, you can find them on the web. Another example is I'm going to disconnect the mouse. I think maybe that'll help. Is the 11th Hour Shira model, which emphasizes the appraisal variable. So again, we have stimuli coming into our appraisal process, and we have a number of appraisal variables. And what this model does is it actually says, well, these variables focus on the relevance of the stimulus. So I'm going to appraise that first. And these variables, the certainty, the urgency, do I need to deal with this quickly? Is it congruent with my goals? Who's responsible for it? These determine the implications. So I'm going to appraise those, evaluate those next. There's coping, what can I do about it? And then there are the social norms. So these groups of variables are evaluated in turn and generate a particular emotion. I guess the mouse didn't fix the problem. But here's an example of particular values on these variables that would then correspond to the emotion fear. So this is the 11th Hour Shira model, which is also called the component process model. And as I said, the emphasis there is on this sort of intermediate layer of domain-independent appraisal dimensions, which he calls emotion components. And emotions are then defined in terms of, if you think of them as a vector, then each emotion would have a unique vector in terms of those appraisal variables. And the variables are evaluated in a fixed sequence. It emphasizes appraisal as a dynamic, evolving process, so it actually makes that explicit. And it also emphasizes the notion that that emotions involve interaction across these multiple modalities. And Shira also defines the processing at multiple levels of abstraction, which is very critical. So you have the very low-level sensory motor processing. Then as the emotions get more complex, you have sort of schematic, routine kind of processing. And then finally, at the highest level, you have the conceptual processing, so fairly standard 3 layers in cognitive science. And there are a number of implementations. This lends itself nicely to black box implementations because you get your vector, you get your emotion, and you're done. You do some kind of a mapping. A lot of times, Euclidean distance is used to actually decide which emotion fits best. But the appraisal dimensions are also being increasingly adopted in sort of more complex cognitive-affective architectures. Okay, so what is the result of this appraisal process? I just want to give you a sense of what comes out of this process. What might an emotion look like? So it might have some subset, or maybe all of these attributes, maybe even some of the other appraisal variables. So certainly type, valence, intensity, what variables affect the intensity, maybe some description, how long does it last, what caused it, what goals are affected, what direction, etc. So, for example, at the most undifferentiated level, you might just say negative. I'm kind of not feeling really good, but I don't know why. So you might leave it at that. Maybe that's all you need in your system. Of course, at the next level, you might actually say which emotion you're feeling. You're feeling fear, and your intensity is almost at a maximum on a scale of 0 to 1. Here are some of the variables that influence the intensity in this particular model. And it turns out that you're feeling fear because there's an aggressive dog. Here he is. And then the duration might be 2 minutes, and you might specify, maybe there's exponential decay or whatever function actually determines how the emotion ramps up and decays. The dog, now the cause, it gets kind of interesting because what is the cause? Is it the dog, or is it the owner, or is it you? Maybe you shouldn't be there. You shouldn't, you're climbing over a fence into someone's yard. Which goals are affected? Well, again, there are choices, so it gets more complicated. So is it safety of self? That certainly makes sense. Maybe you're concerned about the dog. Maybe you want to kick the dog, but then you don't want to hurt him. Maybe you're worried because you're late for a train or something. So there are a number of goals could be violated, and you have to kind of decide which one to, or maybe they're all going to be influencing. Where is your emotion directed? Are you going to be mad at the dog? Well, of course, if you're fearful, I guess it's directed towards you. But let's say you're angry. Are you going to be angry at the dog? Are you going to be angry at the owner who let the dog loose? Are you going to be mad at yourself because you shouldn't be climbing over the fence? And then what's the coping potential? And I guess in the case of fear, the coping potential is usually low. So this just gives you a sense of what some representation might look like. And of course, you might not need all of these, or you might need more of these, depending on what it is you're trying to do. In terms of representation and reasoning alternatives, there are many, many techniques that are appropriate for this or that are used for this. Vector spaces is one, connectionist models. A lot of systems use symbolic representations. Rules are popular. Belief nets are popular. Complex symbolic structures are also increasingly popular. So I'll show you an example of what I mean by that. Sort of complex causal plan structures. Spreading activation over networks is used. Cynthia Brazel, actually, the Kismet robot you saw, uses that. There are sometimes, not as frequently, but people also use decision theoretic formalism, so decision trees and various kinds of decision theoretic utility functions. Blackboards are used, blackboards and knowledge sources. So you might have a knowledge source dedicated for each appraisal dimension, and then they kind of fight it out on the blackboard, and some emotion comes out. Finite state machine, Ivan Kopeček used the finite state machine model a few years back. Markov models are used, theorem proving. So you basically have everything. Interestingly enough, dynamical systems aren't used very often, or in fact, I'm not aware of anyone using them. And it's kind of curious because it seems to me that is a formalism that really is well suited for the sort of, in terms of the sort of space structure. But for some reason, people haven't used that. Here's just a simple example just to show you what a belief net looks like. This is from a simple net from my model. So this deals with coping. So the agent decides whether he's in control and whether he feels competent, and then it influences anger. And you can kind of tweak the prior probabilities as well as the conditional probabilities based on personality, and you can get different contributions towards anger. So this is an example of a very simple structure. Of course, you have many of these in any kind of an appraisal system. Here's an example from Gracia and Marcella's Emma, and this is an example of a very complex structure. So you have the current situation plus a bunch of attributes, utility, probability, but you also have something about how the situation came to be, and you have some kind of a prediction of what's going to happen in the future. This is some kind of a medical end-of-life gruesome scenario here. But it just gives you a sense of the kind of range of complexity of structures that are relevant. So let me move on to modeling emotion effects on cognition. Again, in terms of the computational tasks, we once again have a mapping. So we have some kind of an affective state, mood trait, whatever, that has to be mapped to the effects. And the effects are going to be both on cognition. So again, we have our cognitive processes, attention, perception, memory, and then the higher level processes, learning, problem solving, etc. And we have behavior. So we have facial expression, verbal, nonverbal, action selection, etc. So somehow we have to implement this mapping. So what we need to know, first of all, is what processes and structures are affected and how are they affected. Are there any variability in these effects? I mean, are there some kind of nonlinear effects? And in fact, there are, and that's a challenge to try to figure out exactly how to model that. Does it vary by the individual? Does it vary by the individual depending on what state they're in? What are the other contextual variables that influence this? And how do we integrate multiple emotions in cognition and behavior? And this really, I think this is one of the biggest challenges in modeling effects. In terms of theories, unfortunately, there aren't nearly as many theories in emotion effects as there are for appraisal, which makes it more challenging. The specific mechanisms of the emotion effects are not nearly as well developed as they are for appraisal. And so you kind of have to do a lot of guessing when you're implementing these models. There are a few. There is spreading activation. Bauer proposed this for modeling memory effects and priming, but it has some problems for other effects. Oatley and Johnson have this notion of distinct emotions induce distinct modes of processing, and I think that's actually kind of the dominant theory now. And it's implemented by having emotions correspond to parameters that then influence processing across multiple processes within the architecture. And this is the work that I'm doing, so let me tell you a little bit about that just to make it more concrete. So the idea is that you think of emotions as distinct modes of processing, and you think of them as really distinct patterns of these parameters that have global effects across multiple processes, and also the multiple modalities, not just cognition. And interestingly, it's supported by some recent theories of neuromodulation that Jean-Marc Fellouz has been working on in neuromodulation in brain circuits. So the idea is that you have effects on low-level fundamental processes, attention, working memory, as I already mentioned. You have speed, capacity, content bias. You have this self or thread bias, for example. You also have effects on long-term memory, encoding and retrieval, speed of encoding, elaboration of encoding, biases. And then you have effects on these higher-level processes. So you have effects on problem-solving, decision-making biases, planning, and of course you also have effects on the appraisal processes themselves, which makes for an interesting feedback cycle. And sort of the big question is, can the higher-level effects be explained and implemented in terms of these fundamental effects? And that's a question that a lot of us who are working in this area are asking. So let me just tell you a little bit about my system and how it models emotion effects. So you have traits and states. You have a series of architecture parameters, and you have your cognitive architecture. And so here's examples of the traits that I'm modeling in my system. The traits influence affective states, so they influence how readily these different states will be generated, and they also influence a set of parameters. So looking at the parameters, we have processing parameters, and we also have structural parameters. In the processing parameters, we have module parameters, which actually control the speed and capacity of the different architecture modules. So how fast is the attention working? How many cues can it process in one cycle? Or this is true for all the modules, and I'll show you in a minute which other ones there are. And we also have construct parameters. By construct, I mean cues, situations, goals, kind of the mental constructs, mental objects. And the parameters influence the values of, say, the threat level or the valence and ultimately the rank of a particular construct, which then determines whether that construct is processed or not in a particular cycle. In terms of the structural parameters, we can also control architecture topology. So, for example, maybe we can skip some processing altogether. If the guy is in a hurry, maybe he's not going to do expectation generation. He's not going to think about the future. He's just going to deal with the present. Hang on. Já to tamhle to půjde, myslím. Okay. That was an example of global interrupt situation. So in terms of the structural parameters, we have architecture topology. So you can control the data flow among the modules, and you can also control the long-term memory content and structure. So all of these parameters are calculated based on the whatever the values are for the traits and for the emotions that are dynamically generated. And then they influence processing within this architecture. And the architecture is kind of your see, think, do, attention. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. But situation assessment, which does the appraisal. Expectation projects the situations into the future. We have the affect appraiser, goal manager, and finally the action selection. So just to make it a little bit more concrete, let's say that we have an agent. This architecture is used to model agent behavior in a simulated environment. So let's say we have an agent that has low stability, it's a trait, which predisposes towards negative emotions. So this agent tends to feel higher anxiety and fear. The processing parameters that are going to be affected are going to be the construct parameters affecting the cue selection, situation selection. And what's going to happen is he will preferentially focus on threatening cues and threatening situations. And how is that going to happen? Those constructs, the constructs that have a higher threat level in these that are being processed by these modules will be rated more highly, so that when they arrive, they're, if you get, say, 10 cues and 3 of them are high threatening, it's the high threatening cues that are going to go through attention. They'll be attended, and they will then be further processed. And this is going to cause sort of a permanent, not a permanent, but in a given cycle, it's going to cause a particular bias. Same thing for situation assessment and expectation. And I think I'm going to have to, let me just skip over this. I want to show you how this kind of breaks out. We use this to model peacekeepers, and we define different types of peacekeepers that were encountering different situations that peacekeepers encounter, in this case a hostile crowd. I'll just walk you what happens at each module. So in the case of a normal leader, he sees the crowd, he sees that he's near the objective, and he sees that his unit has high capability, so he's not too worried. The anxious guy, all he focuses on is the large crowd, because his working memory capacity has been reduced, and he's highly focused on the threatening cue. In terms of the situation of assessment, the normal guy sees that his movement is blocked, and really the danger to his unit isn't all that high. But the anxious guy, because he's just focusing on that one cue, he decides that the danger to his unit is very high, so he has this perceptual threat and self-bias. In terms of expectation, the normal guy decides that the danger from the crowd is unlikely, and the anxious guy is deciding, that in fact there is a high danger, something bad's going to happen in the future, and furthermore his career success is threatened because he messed up. In terms of anxiety, the normal guy has normal anxiety module of whatever the bad situation is that he is in, whereas the anxious guy has a very rapid onset of a high state of anxiety. The goal selection, the normal guy chooses what's called non-lethal crowd control, which basically he goes and talks to the people. And this other guy, the anxious guy, is really focusing on defending the unit and on reducing his anxiety. And all of this eventually leads to the normal guy doing the right thing, which is, well, he has to stop because he's blocked, but then he goes and does this, he talks to the crowd. And in contrast, the high anxious guy actually fires into the crowd, and then he does a lot of talking as a way of kind of dealing with his anxiety. So this was work that was funded by this was the first version of MAMIT, my cognitive-affective architecture. This was funded by the U.S. Army Research Institute. So we had to choose a domain that was relevant to them. But in fact, it's a domain-independent architecture, and right now it's being transitioned to a NASA task. So let me I think I'm running out of time, so let me move on to a couple other issues here. What's the level of representation? I just want to highlight that we have a sort of choice of black box models where basically you have input-output and you don't really care what happens in the middle. So you can just map your stimulus to your emotion or your effect to your emotion to your effect. Black box models may be all that you need for a particular application. They're easier to build initially, however, they're more difficult to extend. So just like in expert systems, you have, you pay the price somewhere. Process models actually aim to emulate the internal processing. So you actually try to have some kind of a version of a cognitive architecture. You have memories, processes, and you have your output. So you actually end up having sort of a more full-fledged cognitive-affective architecture. And you're actually trying to implement some kind of a hypothesized mechanism that mediates this emotion appraisal, cognitive appraisal. And these models are typically more difficult initially, but in the end, they tend to be more robust and more general. And of course, if you're trying to actually understand emotion processes, then you can't go too far with black box models. You have to do process models. Let me just very quickly see what kind of an architecture. You have to ask questions like which architectural components are necessary. I showed you an example of my architecture. We had attention, we had situation assessment, sort of interpretation, expectation generation, affect appraiser, planner. So we have to decide which of these modules are important for your architecture. What are the data and control paths among those modules? You also have to decide what kind of fundamental processing paradigm. Do you want to do sequential, the sort of classical see, think, do, I guess in this case, see, think, feel, do? Or do you want to do some kind of parallel distributed processing, which of course is much more realistic with respect to biological agents? I'm going to skip over this since I'm running out of time. And just tell you that many architectures have been developed. Many are sort of emotion-augmented existing architectures. So belief, desire, intention, the BDI architecture is a common one. SOAR and ACT are kind of the old, the old kids on the block. They're symbolic architectures that have large user groups and recognition prime decision making is another one. So there are people who are just sort of adding emotion to these architectures. And there are also people, mostly psychologists, who are coming up with sort of new architectures and designs for architectures that can handle emotion. And I'm going to skip through this. This is my architecture, but you've already seen it. This is basically, these are the modules, the data kind of flows through and generates. These are the constructs that are being generated, and eventually you get some kind of an action. So this is an example of a sequential see, think, do architecture. Just to give you a sense of these generic architectures, what I call the triune architectures, this is an example of, typically we have 3 layers: reactive, which generates sort of what's called proto-affect, very undifferentiated affective states; routine, which generates sort of primitive, simple emotions, good and bad, now and later; and then reflective, which generates your full-fledged emotions. And then you have the degree of flexibility. Of course, these are much more hardwired and fixed, and you get much more flexibility at the higher levels. And here are some things that these layers can do. So at the lowest level, you do approach avoidance, simple drives, classical conditioning. Then at the routine level, you do kind of well-learned routine behavior. You can do some simple predictions, some symbolic processing. And then finally, at the highest level, you have complex mental models, representations of self-awareness, explicit predictions, metacognition. So, okay. So just very quickly to conclude, basically the questions which I just went through and tried to answer really define a framework for model development and model analysis. And I think it's important to begin to think in terms of those kinds of frameworks, because there are so many models out there. Even though it's a young field, people are building, it's a kind of an engineering AI discipline, so everybody plays in their own sandbox. And it's important to really try to kind of figure out how different models relate. And I think this might be a This is a possible framework that outlines the dimensions that can be used to compare and analyze different models. Okay, so let me move on to the summary and conclusions. So I try to motivate the need for including some emotions in some user models in affective architectures. I gave you some background on research in psychology, and I didn't actually cover neuroscience that much. And I try to define some guidelines for developing affective user models and affective cognitive-affective architectures. And talk about this framework. So just a quick summary, successes and state-of-the-art. A lot of success in research in emotion modeling. There are many terminological clarifications that are being possible as we begin to develop these process models and architectures. There's increasing interaction among experimentalists and modelers and theorists, which is very critical for progress in the field. We are increasingly able to construct detailed models of appraisal, and we're starting to do that for emotion effects. It's a more difficult problem. And we're starting to see the convergence on the architecture structure, the sort of triune architecture. And we're starting to see some beginnings of some principles and guidelines for model development. On the applied side, there are many shallow models enhancing HCI and agents. There are beginnings of deep models that can drive agent behavior and robot behavior. You saw an example from Cynthia's Kismet. There's a lot of work, I didn't address this, but there's a lot of work, which is probably relevant to you guys, on sensing and recognition and expression, both in terms of speech, in terms of facial expression. So a lot of interesting work going in that area here, just to remind you what some of the examples are. There are many challenges. Theories, we lack theories. We really need more theories about the mechanisms. We need more theories about the emotion dynamics, the multiple emotions, nonlinear effects. So there are a lot of challenges to be solved. Data is a big problem because typically your model resolution, your model has a much higher resolution typically than the data that are available. So for example, in my case, I was explicitly modeling goals and expectations, but you can't measure them. So you kind of have to infer, well, what is the likely effect of anxiety on a goal and an expectation? So the emotion experiments are difficult, they're challenging, and the data requirements frequently exceed the availability. Model development is very time-consuming, so a big thing that really needs to be done is development of standards, shared data, ontologies, plug-and-play modules, and these kinds of guidelines that I try to lay out. And a big problem also is you have to build long-term memory. If you want to have an agent, you have to build long-term memory. And you basically, it involves an awful lot of tweaking. So the kind of a more theoretical question is this even possible? Or if we're going to be building synthetic agents, do they actually have to evolve their memory as much as we do by interacting with the environment? So that's sort of a more philosophical long-term question. Validation is a big issue. I didn't even address that, but we need to develop more sort of systematic methods and benchmarks for validation. So let me just conclude with a paraphrase of something that Aristotle said about anger. So just subdue escape R for emotion and anger there, and you'll have the original quote. So anyone can model emotions, that is easy, but to model emotions in the right context, to the right degree, at the right time, for the right reason, and in the right way, this is not easy. So thank you.
Thank you very much for a very nice presentation. And we have about 5 minutes for a discussion. I'd like to remind you that you can put questions also in the following panel discussion. So please, questions. Please.
I have one. You gave an amazing amount of stuff, right? So, and I have one question. How do you know when you're wrong?
How do you know when you're wrong about what?
When your model is wrong. How do you test it?
Yeah, no, well, and that's the validation, which we didn't address. Yeah, there are different ways of validating. I know, for example, John and Stacy are doing validation by actually giving their models the same kind of instruments, for example, they would give to people. So you might have some kind of a situation. You might expose a person to a particular kind of situation and give them a self-report instrument to see how anxious they feel. And then you might administer the same thing to a model. And then you can sort of say, okay, at this level we have an agreement, so I'm going to assume that if I test a number of situations and I get the same answers from the humans as I get from the model, I'm going to assume I have a reasonable model of, say, appraisal of anxiety or whatever. So that's one method. You can do various kinds of things. You can try to do knowledge elicitation, and again, in terms of, say, appraisal or emotion effects, you can say expose people to a situation and then ask them, okay, why did you feel this, or did you in fact did you focus on this situation versus this other situation, and then you can see if your model does the same thing. There are problems with all of them because knowledge elicitation, again, how do you know you're eliciting the right thing? You know, you can ask someone, they can make up the, I mean, not intentionally, but they can give you the wrong answer. So it's a big problem. I think the validation issue is really an open question right now, and of course, if you're doing HCI, then you might have some kind of completely different validation criteria, because if you get better effectiveness of interaction, maybe you don't really care if your model is valid, but you know, whatever you have seems to work, so you'll stay with it. So yeah, I think that's a good question, and really, this is just a new area, and people in emotion models are just starting to worry about validation. So.
Other questions, please?
I want to ask if you are building an agent that's like some virtual being without a physical body, and like compare it to a ghost or to an angel, and physical beings have bodies, like physical bodies, and you talked about homeostasis, that emotions help us to keep homeostasis. So is the concept of the body included in your model? Because you understand.
Right. Yeah. And actually, you know, and that comes right back to the four modalities of emotion, and so which ones do you need to model for your particular application? And in my model, no. In my model, I don't actually do embodied agents. I'm just focusing. My focus is really the emotion effects, and I kind of built the agent or the cognitive architecture around it, because that was what I was interested in. I'm trying to understand the mechanisms. But you're right. I mean, again, I think it depends on your application. If you're really trying to understand how emotions work in biological agents, then yes, I think you do have to worry about that at some level. You have to worry about the interacting modalities. If you're trying to do an application and you're trying to generate a synthetic agent, say for a training system, I'm not really sure you need to address that. So it just depends on the application. But it's not. But as I said before, we don't understand emotions well enough. Even though there are some efforts that are actually trying to link the physiology with the emotion, we just don't know enough about it right now. They're just beginnings.
Someone else? Like to put questions?
Short, but in therapy and also many training for managers, one of the topics is you have to control your emotions. So you have to reduce your negative effects. For example, you show anxiety. Of course, when I see a dog, I'm anxious. But you can also use it in a positive way. It concentrates you, for example, to do an exam. You need some anxiety and so on. So it depends highly on the frame of reference, and that is changeable. So you can reason about that, and maybe at first anxious, after some days you don't consider as anxious anymore. And so it depends a lot of many other. It's a dynamic process. Right. And I was wondering that some people, as you show it, they consider it as a sort of static evaluation. So anxiety is, per definition, negative, and I think that's not true.
Oh, I see what you're saying. No, I'm sorry if I gave that impression. No, I was just trying to sort of give a drive-by overview of a lot of different things. No, of course, anxiety can be, you have this sort of curve of, your performance goes up with some stress level, some anxiety, and I mean, you brought up a bunch of different issues. You brought up the controlling your emotions. So metacognition and reappraisal are relevant here, and people are actually trying to model that. The John Gratch and Stacy Marcella, their model focuses on appraisal and on coping in particular, and on reappraisal. So they actually have a model of that, and you can certainly we know enough about emotion regulation to start to build models that actually try to force reappraisal. So you get an emotion, you sense that you're too anxious or not anxious enough, I guess, I don't know, and then you kind of force the reappraisal process. So I definitely did not. That's why I kept talking about the emotion dynamics, because I definitely didn't want to give the impression that it's a one-shot process, because it isn't, and it isn't in these systems either. It's an evolving process.
So the last questions, please.
I see that your model is for the effect for the agent. Yeah? If the agent receives some kind of stimuli, then he will, it will react. But how can we adapt it for user emotion assessment in the input side?
Okay. This my model doesn't address that. But yeah, if you want to do assessment, then of course you have to focus on the sensing and recognition, which I didn't address that. But you can use a lot of the modalities I mentioned. Certainly physiological, certainly facial expressions, speech, body posture. You have sensors, and there are well-developed algorithms and sensors that you can sense these signals. You map them into the emotion, and usually the people usually use right now forced choice kinds of situations. So you have a fixed set of, say, basic emotions, and then the algorithms will pick one of those, and you can do it in a supervised learning or unsupervised learning kind of a situation. So people are doing that kind of work and having a fair amount of success with basic emotions. And so you would be addressing, when I had that initial diagram with the input output, this would be, your question kind of addresses the sensing and recognition. And then the model, of course, if you have an affective model, affective user model, it can help you in that process, because it can help you disambiguate some of the results. But did I answer your question? The history of.
Yeah.
Could you postpone it for
Sure,
final session?
yeah.
Thank you once again.
Okay, thanks.